The wind came in a hurry that December, screaming down from the mountains like a hungry wolf. It brought a blizzard so thick, so final, you couldn't see your own hand in front of your face. The snow wasn't just falling, it was attacking, burying the whole Montana wilderness under a suffocating blanket of white. Deep inside that swirling chaos, perched on a lonely stretch of land called Pine Ridge, was a small cabin. It was just one room, built of rough-hewn logs, fighting to stand its ground against the storm. Inside, a fire roared in the stone hearth, spitting and hissing, throwing dancing shadows that looked like giants on the walls. In the center of that one room, on a narrow bed, a woman named Grace Sullivan was fighting her own storm. Her knuckles were white, gripping the edge of the mattress so hard they looked like they might snap. A wave of pain, sharp and blinding, ripped through her. She bit down hard on her lip, trying to swallow the scream, and the coppery taste of blood filled her mouth. "Breathe, Grace." A man's voice cut through the fog of her pain. It was steady, but you could hear the strain underneath it. "Just like I showed you." Jackson Reed moved around the bed with a quiet efficiency that seemed out of place in the wildness of the moment. He was a big man, his forearms corded with muscle and crisscrossed with old faded scars where he'd rolled up the sleeves of his cotton shirt. Sweat beaded on his forehead, shining in the firelight, even though the cabin was barely holding back the freezing cold. His hands, surprisingly gentle for their size, arranged clean linens beneath her. Grace's eyes, wild with pain, locked onto his. "You promised," she gasped, the words torn from her between contractions. Her voice was a ragged whisper, but it carried the weight of a dying wish. "You promised you wouldn't let me go. Not like Sarah." Something flickered in Jackson's face, a flash of old pain, of a memory so terrible it was almost a physical thing. It was there, and then it was gone, buried under a mask of pure determination. He gave a single, sharp nod, his jaw set like stone. "I won't fail," he said, his voice low and rough. "Not this time." Outside, the wind howled and slammed against the windows, rattling the very bones of the little cabin. The storm wasn't just a storm, it was a prison. It had sealed them off from the world, from any chance of help, from any hope of escape. There was only this room, this fire, and these two people trapped together by a promise spoken in the dark. Jackson's hands trembled, just for a second, as he checked Grace's progress. He didn't like what he found. It was too soon. Way too soon. The baby wasn't supposed to come for another month. He turned to a medical bag he'd laid out on a small desk, its instruments gleaming in the firelight, arranged with an almost military precision. "The baby's coming fast," he said, his voice a low, controlled rumble. "Grace, I need you to be strong now, stronger than you've ever been." Her eyes, the color of amber in the flickering light, met his. The world seemed to stop. In that silence, you could feel everything that had passed between them in the last 3 months. The shared meals in silence, the slow, cautious building of trust, the unspoken understanding of two people who were both running from ghosts. "I am strong," she whispered, and she believed it. Then another contraction hit, a monster bigger than all the rest. Her world collapsed into a single point of blinding pain and crushing pressure, and the desperate, primal need to bring her child into this world, alive and safe. As Grace fought her battle inside the cabin, the snow kept falling outside. It fell without a sound, covering their tracks, bearing their secrets, and offering the world a clean, white slate. But some secrets don't stay buried. Some sins leave stains so deep, not even a blizzard can wash them away. And what Grace didn't know was that the real storm wasn't the one outside the cabin walls. The real storm was coming for them, and it had a name. 3 months earlier, Grace Sullivan sat alone on a splintered bench at the White Ridge Station. It wasn't much of a station, just a wind-beaten platform and a tiny office with a wisp of smoke curling from its chimney. Her small valise sat by her feet. Her worn woolen coat was pulled tight around her, but it couldn't hide the gentle curve of her belly. 6 months pregnant. Abandoned, again. The September wind had a mean streak, cutting right through her clothes with the first cold promise of the winter to come. But Grace didn't cry. She'd used up all her tears in dark corners of rented rooms in the lonely hours before the dawn. Now she just waited. For what? She wasn't entirely sure. The man Edward Fleming had been a dream. He was handsome, charming, with a silver tongue and pockets full of promises about a new life. A new beginning out west, where there was gold in the hills and a man could make his fortune. He'd taken her hand, looked her in the eye, and sworn he'd take care of her. For a woman of 38, with a past she was desperate to outrun, his words had been like water in a desert, until that morning on the train. His hand had brushed against the swell of her stomach, and the look on his face had changed in a heartbeat. It went from confusion to calculation, to a cold, hard dismissal that chilled her to the bone. 38 and in the family way, he'd laughed, a sound as brittle and ugly as frozen twigs. You should have told me, Grace. You really should have. And then he was gone. He'd stepped off the train at White Ridge, taking her large trunk with him, leaving her with nothing but the clothes on her back and the small valise at her feet. He hadn't even looked back. The station master, a skinny man with worried eyes, had given her a look that was half pity, half suspicion, before disappearing back into his little office. The last train had already left. Night was falling fast and the temperature was dropping with it. Grace reached into her pocket and pulled out a worn leather pouch. Her fingers found the familiar shapes inside. Thimbles, needles, a small pair of silver scissors that had belonged to her mother. It was all she had left of her old life. At the bottom was a folded piece of embroidery, a half-finished pattern of wildflowers around the words, "Freedom comes." The rest of the phrase was unstitched. It was her mother's last work, left unfinished when she died 5 years ago. Her mother, Esther Sullivan, had been an emancipated slave. She'd built a life from nothing and had taught her daughter two things: how to sew with such precision that rich white ladies would pay a fortune for it, and how to endure when the world gave you nothing but cruelty. Grace ran her thumb over the rough stitches, drawing a strength she didn't know she had from that connection. She would not break, not here, not now, not after surviving Charles. Just the thought of her husband's name sent a shiver down her spine that had nothing to do with the cold. Charles Porter, a respected politician in Philadelphia, a pillar of his community, a man who smiled for the cameras while his fingernails dug crescent-shaped wounds into her arm. Behind closed doors, he was a monster. She had planned her escape for months, waiting until he left on a long campaign tour. She had saved every penny. She had covered her tracks. What she hadn't planned on was finding out she was pregnant a few weeks later. She hadn't planned on meeting Edward, and she definitely hadn't planned on ending up here, alone, at a desolate train station in the middle of nowhere, with winter breathing down her neck. A sound pulled her from her thoughts, the crunch of heavy boots on gravel. A tall man emerged from the growing darkness. He moved with a slow, deliberate pace, like someone who knew this harsh land and respected it. A worn hat shadowed most of his face, and a thick beard covered his jaw. He was carrying a rifle in one hand and a leather satchel in the other. Grace's back went ramrod straight. One hand flew to her belly, a purely instinctual gesture of protection. The other tightened on the handle of her valise. She'd learned the hard way to be suspicious of men who appeared out of the shadows. He stopped a few feet away, just watching her. In the faint light from the station window, she could see his eyes. They were the color of steel. "Station's closing," he said. His voice was rough, gravelly, like it wasn't used to being used. "Storm's coming." It wasn't a threat, it was just a fact. But Grace didn't move. "I'm aware," she said, her own voice steady, betraying none of the cold that had seeped deep into her bones. His gaze dropped from her face to the curve of her stomach, then back up again. There was no judgment in his look, just a quiet assessment. "You waiting for someone?" A bitter laugh almost escaped her lips. "No," she said, "not anymore." He gave a single nod, as if he understood everything she hadn't said. He glanced up at the sky, where the clouds were growing heavy and dark. "Name's Jackson Reed," he said after a long, silent moment. "Got a cabin up on Pine Ridge. It's warm. Got food." Grace stared at him, searching his face, his words for the trap. She was looking for the hidden price of his offer. Men like him didn't just give things away for free. "Why would you help me?" she asked, her voice sharp. He shrugged, a small, simple movement of his broad shoulders. Nobody should die of cold when there's shelter to be had. Die of cold. The words hung in the air between them, stark and brutally honest. That was her reality. If she stayed here, she and her unborn child would freeze to death. Her hand moved to her belly again, feeling the faint flutter of life inside. The station door creaked open, and the skinny station master poked his head out. "Mr. Reed," he called, "got your medicine order. Best get back before the weather turns for the worse." Jackson raised a hand to acknowledge him but kept his steel-colored eyes locked on Grace. "I don't need charity," she said quietly. "Didn't offer any," he replied, his voice still rough. "Just shelter and a meal." She weighed her options. They weren't good. Stay here and freeze, or go with this stranger, this mountain man with a rifle, who could be dangerous in 100 ways she couldn't even imagine. But there was something in his steady gaze, in the way he kept his distance, that suggested he wasn't a threat. Not in the way she was used to anyway. And besides, she had a small, sharp knife tucked into her boot. A little precaution she'd started carrying during her marriage to Charles. "All right," she said, pulling herself to her feet, her back aching from the cold and the pregnancy. Jackson just nodded once, as if he'd known she would agree all along. He turned to get his package from the station master. Grace picked up her valise, her whole world packed into one small bag. When Jackson returned, he led her to a sturdy wagon hitched to a tired-looking mule. "It's an hour's ride," he said, not offering to take her bag, as if he understood she needed to hold on to what little she had left. "Road gets rough." He wasn't kidding. The wagon jostled and bounced over the rutted trail as darkness swallowed them whole. Each bump sent a jolt of pain through Grace's exhausted body. She gritted her teeth and held on, focusing on the steady rhythm of the mule's plodding feet. Jackson didn't say a word. He didn't ask her who she was, or why she was alone, or whose child she was carrying. The silence wasn't comfortable, but it wasn't threatening either. It just was. The trail started to climb, winding its way through a forest of dark pines. The air grew colder, the wind sharper. The first snowflakes began to fall, tiny and sharp like bits of glass. Grace shivered, pulling her thin coat tighter. Without a word, Jackson reached behind him, pulled out a thick, heavy wool blanket, and handed it to her. She took it, grateful for the warmth and the simple, unspoken kindness. After what felt like an eternity, the wagon crested a ridge. Below them, nestled in the darkness, was a single point of light, a small cabin, with smoke curling from its chimney. It looked simple, solid, and completely, utterly alone. Jackson pulled the wagon to a stop and climbed down. This time, he did offer her his hand. His grip was firm, strong, but he let go the second her feet were on the ground. "Watch your step," he said, holding up a lantern to light the path. "Gets icy here." The inside of the cabin was a surprise. It was just one room, but it was cleaner and more orderly than any place she'd been in months. A fire burned in the hearth, casting a warm orange glow on the log walls. A simple table and 2 chairs stood in the middle of the room. A narrow bed was tucked against one wall. The other wall was lined with shelves, filled with books and jars and containers, all arranged with a strange, meticulous care. In one corner, a desk was covered with papers and what looked like medical instruments. "You're a doctor," Grace said. It was the first question she'd asked him. Jackson set down his rifle and took off his hat. His dark hair was streaked with gray at the temples. "Was," he said, moving to stoke the fire. "Not anymore." He gestured to one of the chairs by the fire. "Sit. You're cold." She moved to the chair, letting the warmth from the fire soak into her frozen bones. It felt so good, she almost cried. "Hungry?" he asked, moving to a small kitchen area. "Yes," she admitted. There was no point in pride. Not now. He prepared a simple meal of beans and dried meat and warm cornbread. He worked with a quiet, methodical rhythm, like a man who was used to taking care of himself. He set a plate in front of her, then took his own food over to his desk, giving her space. As she ate, Grace's eyes scanned the cabin. On a shelf near the bed, she saw a small carved wooden box, a tarnished silver pocket watch, and a small framed photograph. She couldn't make out the picture from where she was sitting. Next to it was a thick, leather-bound book. A journal, maybe. Its spine was cracked, like it had been read over and over again. On the opposite wall, there were bunches of drying herbs and more medical supplies. Clean bandages, bottles of strange liquids, surgical tools kept in perfect order. This was the home of a man who needed control, who valued precision above all else. "You can take the bed," Jackson said, his voice breaking the silence. "I'll sleep by the fire." Grace put down her spoon. "Why are you doing this?" she asked again. "Why are you helping me?" He looked at her, his steel-colored eyes unreadable in the firelight. "Told you," he said. "Nobody should freeze when there's shelter." "And tomorrow?" she pressed. "Tomorrow's not here yet," he said simply. "Storm's coming. We'll be snowed in for a few days. After that?" He shrugged. "Your choice." She knew what he meant. After that, she was on her own again. "I won't be a burden," she said firmly. "I can cook. I can clean. I can mend clothes." He just nodded. "Fair enough." Later, as she prepared for bed behind a small screen he'd set up for her, she saw him take a book from the shelf and settle into his chair by the fire. The cabin grew quiet, the only sounds the crackle of the flames and the soft turn of a page. Grace slipped under the warm blankets, her body aching with exhaustion. The pillow smelled clean, like pine and wood smoke. She kept her little knife within reach, a habit she couldn't break. Just before she drifted off to sleep, her eyes fell on the photograph again. From the bed, she could see it more clearly. It was a woman with dark hair and serious eyes, standing next to a little girl, maybe 5 or 6 years old. The little girl had the same sad, serious expression. The woman's hand rested on the child's shoulder, a gesture of quiet tenderness. And next to the photo was that leather-bound book. She could just make out the title, embossed in faded gold letters. Advances in Obstetrical Medicine. Obstetrics, the study of childbirth. Grace's hand went to her own belly. The pieces started to click into place, forming a picture she recognized all too well. The former doctor. The book about childbirth. The photograph of a woman and child who weren't here anymore. This man wasn't a monster. He was a ghost. He knew grief. He knew it as well as she knew fear. And with that thought, a strange sense of calm settled over her. Jackson Reed wasn't looking to hurt her. He had enough demons of his own. For the first time in months, Grace closed her eyes and let herself truly rest. Outside, the wind howled and the first real snow of winter began to fall, covering her tracks, erasing the path that had led her to the strange, lonely sanctuary in the heart of the wilderness. She was safe for now, but she had a feeling this was just the beginning, the calm before a much bigger storm. The next morning, the world outside the cabin was a sea of white. Grace woke up to the smell of coffee and the quiet sounds of Jackson moving around the small room. He was at the stove, his back to her, and it was clear he'd been awake for hours. He turned when he heard her stir, giving her a small nod. "Coffee's hot," he said. "Breakfast is almost ready." They ate in silence just like the night before, but it felt different in the daylight. Less tense. Through the frosted window, Grace could see nothing but snow-covered pines stretching for miles in every direction. It was beautiful, but it was also terrifying. They were completely and utterly alone. "How long have you lived here?" she asked, breaking the silence. He looked up, seeming to consider whether to answer. 5 years, he finally said. "Alone?" A shadow passed over his face, so quick she almost missed it. "Yes." She didn't ask any more questions. She knew what it was like to have wounds you didn't want anyone to touch. After breakfast, Jackson pulled on a heavy coat and his hat. "Need to check the animals. Bring in more wood," he said. "Storm's getting worse. We could be snowed in for a week." As soon as he was gone, Grace let her curiosity get the better of her. She moved around the small cabin, her eyes taking in every detail. On the shelf above the bed, she saw the collection of small carved wooden animals. A deer, a bear, an eagle. They were carved with a surprising skill, a hidden artistry. Her eyes went back to the thick medical book, Advances in Obstetrical Medicine. She picked it up carefully. It was heavy, the leather cover worn smooth. It fell open in her hands to a section on something called puerperal fever, childbed fever, The margins of the pages were filled with notes, written in a sharp, slanting handwriting. Some sentences were underlined so hard the paper was almost torn. As she turned a page, a piece of folded paper slipped out and fluttered to the floor. She bent down, her belly making the movement awkward, and picked it up. It was a letter. The paper creased and soft from being read over and over. The words were formal, cold, official. The Board of Medical Directors regrets to inform you that your request for reinstatement has been denied. While we acknowledge your distinguished service as a military surgeon, the circumstances surrounding the deaths of multiple patients under your care during the fever outbreak of 1880, including that of your wife, Sarah Reed, render your return to practice inadvisable. Sarah Reed, the woman from the photograph, the promise Grace had made him repeat. You promised you wouldn't let me go like Sarah. She kept reading, her heart pounding in her chest. Your theories regarding hand washing and instrument sterilization as preventative measures remain controversial at best. We suggest you consider retirement as the most honorable course. The loss of your wife and daughter was indeed tragic, but your continued insistence that your colleagues' practices were responsible reflects poorly on the profession. Grace carefully refolded the letter. Her hands were shaking. Now she understood. Jackson Reed hadn't just lost his family. He'd lost everything. His career, his reputation. He'd been trying to save women, trying to tell his fellow doctors that they were killing their patients with their own dirty hands, and they had laughed at him. They had called him crazy, deranged with grief. So he had run. He had come here, to this lonely cabin in the middle of nowhere, to hide from the world that had taken everything from him. She put the letter back in the book, placing it exactly where she'd found it, just as the cabin door opened with a gust of wind and snow. Jackson stood there, his arms full of firewood. Grace quickly moved away from the shelf, turning to wash the breakfast dishes, her heart still hammering against her ribs. If Jackson noticed her strange behavior, he didn't say anything. Storm's getting worse, he said, shaking the snow from his coat. Looks like it's settling in for a while. A few days later, a strange, quiet routine had settled over the cabin. Jackson would rise before dawn to tend to his few animals and chop wood. Grace would cook their simple meals and spend the days mending Jackson's worn clothes. It was a way to earn her keep, a way to feel useful. In the evenings, they would sometimes play a game of checkers, the silence between them slowly becoming more comfortable. They never spoke of their past, but an unspoken understanding was growing between them. They were two broken people, finding a strange sort of peace in their shared isolation. Then one afternoon, Grace saw a figure on horseback making its way slowly up the trail. Her first thought was Charles. Had he found her? But Jackson, who was outside splitting logs, didn't seem concerned. That's Margaret, he said, setting down his axe. She's the midwife from town. Comes by every now and then. The woman who swung down from the horse was older than Grace expected, maybe 70, with sharp blue eyes that seemed to see everything. She carried a large basket and walked with a confidence that defied her age. Jackson, she said with a brisk nod. Then her sharp eyes landed on Grace. And you must be the woman Tommy from the station was talking about. Grace stood up straight, meeting the old woman's gaze. Grace Sullivan, she said, deliberately using her mother's name, not her husband's. The woman's eyes dropped to Grace's belly, then back to her face. Margaret Fletcher, she said, I deliver the babies and do the doctoring in these parts. Inside over coffee, Margaret got straight to the point. How far along are you? About 7 months, Grace said. The baby should come in December. Margaret nodded. Mind if I have a look? I like to know what I'm walking into. Grace hesitated, glancing at Jackson. He's a doctor, Margaret said, following her gaze. Or he was. But I understand if you'd rather have some privacy. Jackson didn't wait for an answer. I'll go check on the animals, he said, grabbing his coat and heading out the door. Margaret's examination was quick and professional. Her hands, though old and gnarled, were surprisingly gentle. Baby's a healthy size, she commented. Strong heartbeat. You've been taking care of yourself. Jackson makes sure of it, Grace said. A flicker of approval crossed Margaret's face. Good. He knows what's needed, even if he doesn't practice anymore. She settled back in her chair, her blue eyes studying Grace intently. So, What brings a city woman like you all the way out to White Ridge, alone and in your condition? Grace knew she couldn't lie to this woman. In a place this small, this isolated, trust was a kind of currency. I was running away, she admitted, from my husband. He's not a kind man. Margaret just snorted. They rarely are, in my experience. Does he know about the child? No, Grace said. I didn't even know myself when I left. I met another man on the train. He promised me a new life. Then he found out I was pregnant and left me at the station. Men, Margaret said, her voice filled with disgust. Always writing checks their character can't cash. She took a sip of her coffee, her eyes never leaving Grace's face. And Jackson? How does he fit into all this? He doesn't, Grace said quickly. He just offered me shelter when I had nowhere else to go. I'm grateful, but I don't expect anything more. Margaret seemed satisfied with that answer. Jackson's a good man, she said, her voice softening slightly. Broken, but good. Lost his wife and daughter to the childbed fever 5 years back. Sarah and Emma. He couldn't save them, though Lord knows he tried. Grace's hand went to her belly. I know, she whispered. I saw the photograph. He still studies, Margaret said, nodding towards the bookshelf. Still trying to figure it out. Believes doctors are killing women by not washing their hands. They laughed him right out of Boston for it. But he's right. I know he's right. She leaned forward, her voice dropping to a conspiratorial whisper. I started washing my hands with lye soap after every birth when my own daughter died of the fever, years ago. I haven't lost a mother to infection since. Just then, the door opened and Jackson came back in. He looked from Margaret to Grace, sensing the serious mood in the room. Everything all right? He asked. Mother and child are both healthy, Margaret reported, but she'll need watching as her time gets closer. First babies can be difficult. Jackson just nodded, his face giving nothing away. I'll keep an eye on her. After Margaret left, a new kind of silence settled over the cabin. It wasn't empty anymore. It was filled with unspoken things. She told me about your wife and daughter, Grace said softly. I'm sorry, Jackson. He was standing with his back to her, but she saw his shoulders tense up. For a long time, he didn't say anything. When he finally turned around, his face was a stony mask. Sarah, he said, and the name sounded like it was being ripped from his throat. And Emma, the fever took them, 5 days after Emma was born. He cleared his throat, his eyes staring at something far away. I tried to save them. It wasn't enough. Grace knew better than to offer empty words of comfort. Instead, she said, that's why you study, to understand what happened. To prevent it from happening again, he corrected her, his voice low and fierce. Doctors are killing women with their dirty hands and their dirty instruments. The board in Boston wouldn't listen. They called my theories controversial. They said I was deranged with grief. The bitterness in his voice was a raw, open wound. Grace looked at him, at this broken, brilliant man, and a sudden, terrifying thought struck her. She was pregnant. She was isolated. And the man who was caring for her was haunted by the ghost of a wife who had died in childbirth. Her hand rested on her belly, where her own child was kicking and turning. A cold fear snaked its way up her spine. Jackson saw the look on her face. He saw the fear in her eyes. He took a step closer, and his voice was no longer bitter. It was a promise, a vow. I won't let it happen to you, Grace, he said, and his steel-colored eyes burned with a fire she'd never seen before. I won't. In that moment, Grace knew 2 things for certain. The first was that this man would move heaven and earth to keep her and her baby safe. The second, more terrifying thought was that this birth would either be his redemption or it would destroy him completely. The stakes had just gotten a whole lot higher. October bled into November. The days grew short and the nights grew long and cold. Grace's body changed, her belly swelling, the baby inside her a constant, living presence. Jackson watched her with the careful eye of a doctor, making sure she ate, that she rested, preparing special teas for the aches and pains that came with the last months of pregnancy. His care was always professional, always respectful. He never crossed the line, but the line was starting to blur. They started talking more, sharing small pieces of their past. He told her stories about being a surgeon in the war. She told him about her mother's sewing shop in Philadelphia. They were like two planets that had been knocked out of their orbits, slowly, cautiously, finding a new gravity in each other. Margaret visited twice more. After her last visit, she pulled Jackson aside. Grace couldn't hear what they were saying, but when Jackson came back inside, his face was grim. He went straight to his desk and started poring over his medical books, his pen scratching furiously in the margins. "Is everything all right?" Grace asked, a knot of worry tightening in her stomach. He looked up, his expression serious. "The baby's big," he said. "Margaret's concerned about the delivery." He hesitated, then added, his voice barely a whisper. "Sarah was in labor for 20 hours with Emma." He was trying to warn her, and to reassure her, in his own strange way. He was telling her he knew what could go wrong. He was telling her he was prepared. "I'm stronger than I look," she said, her voice more confident than she felt. A flicker of respect showed in his eyes. "I know," he said. That night, she dreamed of Charles. He was standing in the doorway of the cabin, the snow swirling around him like a shroud. His face was twisted into that cold, familiar rage. "Did you really think you could hide from me?" he hissed, stepping inside. "Did you think I wouldn't find you?" She tried to run, but her pregnant body was slow and clumsy. He grabbed her arm, his fingers digging into her flesh. "You and the child belong to me," he snarled. "I'll never let you go." She woke up with a strangled cry, her heart pounding, her body slick with cold sweat. A shadow moved by the bed. It was Jackson holding a lantern. Concern was etched into the lines of his face. "Nightmare?" he asked quietly. She could only nod, the fear still choking her. He didn't press her. He just went back to his chair by the fire, a silent guardian in the dark. "It was Charles," she finally whispered into the quiet room. "My husband." The words started to spill out of her then, a torrent of fear and pain she'd held inside for too long. "He's a politician in Philadelphia, respected, admired, but he's a monster. If he finds out about the baby, he'll never stop looking for us. He needs an heir. For his legacy, he'll take the child and he'll get rid of me." She swallowed hard. "He enjoyed hurting me." Jackson didn't say anything for a long time. The only sound was the crackle of the fire. When he finally spoke, his voice was flat, certain. "He won't find you here," he said. "Not before the baby comes. After that, we'll figure something out." "We." The word hung in the air between them, small and simple, but it changed everything. Just then, the baby gave a powerful kick, so strong it made Grace gasp. Without thinking, she reached out, took Jackson's hand, and placed it on her belly. "Here," she whispered. "Feel." Jackson froze. He looked down at his hand on her stomach, his face a mixture of shock, fear, and something else. Something deeper. Something that looked like wonder. The baby kicked again, a strong, insistent thump against his palm. "Strong," he murmured, a hint of a smile in his voice. "Like her mother," Grace replied, a real smile touching her own lips for the first time in what felt like an eternity. His eyes met hers over the curve of her belly, and for the first time, she saw the ghost of a real smile on his face. "Yes," he said softly, "exactly like her mother." He pulled his hand back, but the warmth of his touch lingered. A boundary had been crossed, a connection had been made. Outside, the wind howled, but inside the small cabin, a fragile peace had settled. They were no longer just a doctor and a patient, a rescuer and a victim. They were something else, something new, and they were in this together. But the world outside wasn't going to leave them alone for long, and what they didn't know was that the monster from Grace's nightmares was already on his way. He was closer than they could ever imagine, and he wasn't coming alone. The quiet peace of their sanctuary was about to be shattered into a million pieces. The first week of December, the real snows came, a thick, heavy blanket of it, 3 feet deep, burying the world and sealing them inside the cabin. Grace was in the final stretch, her body heavy and tired, the baby a constant, pressing weight. Jackson watched her like a hawk, his concern growing with every passing day. Margaret hadn't been able to make it through the snow for over a week. They were on their own. One evening, as Grace was sewing tiny clothes from a piece of blue fabric Margaret had brought, Jackson was working on a small wooden cradle, his knife moving smoothly over the pine. "What will you name the baby?" he asked, his voice quiet. "I haven't decided," she said. "If it's a girl, I was thinking of Hope." He looked up from his carving, and for a second, she saw a flicker of that old pain in his eyes. "Hope," he said, testing the word. "That's a good name. Means something." Later that night it started, a sharp, sudden pain that stole her breath away. She gasped, clutching her belly. Jackson was at his desk reading. He looked up instantly. "Contraction?" he asked, his voice all business. She nodded. "I think so." He was by her side in a second, his hands gently probing her abdomen, his touch clinical and professional. "Could just be the body rehearsing," he said, but his eyes were watchful. "Try to sleep. Wake me if they get stronger." She didn't sleep. The pains came and went all night, teasing her, but never settling into a real rhythm. The next day passed in a strange, tense quiet. Jackson chopped extra wood, filled every bucket with water, and checked his medical supplies over and over again. He was preparing for battle. As evening fell, another storm began to roll in. Jackson was standing at the window, staring out into the swirling snow, his whole body rigid. "What is it?" Grace asked, a cold dread creeping over her. "Riders," he said, his voice tight. "3 of them, coming up the trail." Grace's heart stopped. "Charles," she whispered. "Can't tell." He moved to the door and picked up his rifle. "Stay inside. Don't open the door for anyone." Before he could even step outside, they heard hoofbeats in the small yard, and a man's voice called out, cutting through the wind. "Jackson Reed, it's Edward Fleming. I've come for Grace Sullivan." The blood drained from Grace's face. Edward, the man who had abandoned her, the man who knew her real name, the man who could lead Charles right to her doorstep. Jackson's face was like granite. "Stay here," he repeated, his voice leaving no room for argument. He stepped out onto the porch, closing the door firmly behind him. Grace scrambled to the window, peering through a crack in the curtains. She could see them now. Edward, looking cold and miserable in his fancy city clothes, and 2 other men. They were rough-looking, with hard faces and guns on their hips. Hired muscle. She couldn't hear what they were saying over the wind, but she saw Edward gesturing toward the cabin, his voice angry and demanding. Jackson just stood there, his rifle held loosely at his side, not moving, not speaking. Why? Why was Edward here? What could he possibly want with her now? And then, the answer hit her with the force of a physical blow, a sudden, terrible realization that made her feel sick to her stomach. Edward hadn't just been a charming liar who had robbed her and left her for dead. It was worse than that, so much worse. He had been working for Charles all along. The whole thing, the sweet words, the promises of a new life, even abandoning her at the station, it had all been a setup, a twisted, cruel plan to isolate her, to leave her stranded and helpless until Charles could come and claim what he believed was his. Another pain seized her, 10 times sharper than before. It wasn't a practice contraction. This was real. This was happening. Grace grabbed the edge of the window frame, her knuckles turning white as her body began the fight to bring her child into the world. Outside, the standoff was escalating. Edward dismounted and took a step toward the porch. Jackson didn't move an inch. One of the hired guns put his hand on his pistol. Grace couldn't stand it. She threw open the door and stepped out onto the porch, the freezing wind tearing at her dress. "Grace!" Edward called, a fake, greasy smile plastered on his face. "Thank God, we found you. Your husband has been sick with worry." "Go back inside," Jackson said, his voice a low growl, never taking his eyes off the men. Grace ignored him. "What are you doing here, Edward?" she demanded. "I've come to take you home," he said. "Charles is in town. He's brought the authorities." He gestured to the 2 thugs with him. "These men are deputies." It was a lie. She could see it in their shifty eyes. "I am home," she said, her voice shaking but strong. "And I'm not going anywhere with you." Edward's smile vanished. Don't be a fool, Grace. Charles is your husband. He has a legal right to you and to the child. Another contraction hit her, a monster of a thing that buckled her knees. She grabbed the porch railing to keep from falling. Jackson saw it. He shifted his stance, moving to block her from their view. She's not going anywhere, he said, his voice like iron. Especially not now. Edward's eyes narrowed, finally understanding. The child is coming, he said. All the more reason she needs a proper doctor, not some backwoods hermit. My husband, Grace bit out through gritted teeth, is a monster who beat me for years. I will not let my child anywhere near him. One of the hired guns spat into the snow. Look, we ain't here to argue. The lady's coming with us, one way or another. Her husband's paying good money. Jackson's rifle came up just a few inches, but it was enough. She's not property, he said, his voice deadly quiet. She's a free woman, and she's made her choice. The air crackled with tension. Then Grace cried out, a raw, animal sound of pain as the strongest contraction yet ripped through her. It's starting, she gasped. The baby's coming now. For the first time, Edward looked genuinely alarmed. Even the hired guns looked uneasy. Look, the older of the two thugs said, we was told to bring a woman back to town. Nobody said nothing about no birthing. He turned his horse. I'm out. My own ma died in childbirth. I ain't having that on my conscience. He looked at Jackson. Take care of her, Doc. With that, he and the other man turned and rode back down the trail, disappearing into the snow. Edward was left alone, his face a mask of pure fury. This isn't over, he screamed over the wind. Charles will come himself, and he won't be alone. He scrambled back onto his horse and galloped away, swallowed by the storm. Jackson waited until he was gone. Then he turned to Grace, his face etched with worry. Inside, he said, his voice suddenly gentle. He put a strong arm around her waist and helped her back into the warmth of the cabin. He'll be back, she sobbed, a mixture of fear and pain and exhaustion washing over her. He'll come back with Charles. Jackson helped her to the bed, his face grim. Probably, he said, not offering her any false comfort. But not tonight, not in this storm. He looked at her, his eyes dark and serious. And by morning, things will be different. She knew what he meant. By morning, her baby would be here. I'm afraid, she whispered. He paused in his preparations, his gaze meeting hers. I know, he said softly, but you are not alone. I promised you'd be safe here, Grace. I meant it. She looked into his eyes and she saw it. Not just determination, something deeper. Something that had grown between them in the quiet, lonely weeks in this cabin. Something that felt an awful lot like loyalty. I believe you, she whispered. Outside, the storm raged, a wild symphony of wind and snow. Inside, a new battle was just beginning. Grace closed her eyes and took a deep breath, gathering all her strength. Her child would be born free. She would make sure of it, and she would face whatever came next, not as a victim, but as a warrior, with this quiet, steady man by her side. The night stretched before them, long and dark, full of pain and danger. But for the first time, it was also full of hope. The night became a blur of pain and breathing. Each contraction was a wave, crashing over Grace, trying to pull her under. Jackson was a rock in the middle of that storm. He moved around the cabin with a calm, steady purpose, heating water, laying out clean linens, arranging his medical instruments with the focus of a general preparing for a final, desperate battle. They'll come back, Grace gasped between contractions, her voice a raw whisper. Charles won't give up. Let them come, Jackson said, his voice a low rumble. He took her hand, his grip strong and sure. Right now, this is all that matters. He nodded towards her belly. The baby. Their only focus. Hours bled into one another. Time lost all meaning. There was only the rhythm of the pain, the howl of the wind outside, and the steady presence of Jackson beside her. He was more than a doctor now. He was her anchor. You've done this before, she said during a rare moment of calm. He nodded, his face grim. As an army surgeon, in field hospitals during the war. A shadow crossed his face. And with Sarah. The ghost of his dead wife was in the room with them. Grace could feel it. She could feel the weight of his failure, the grief that had driven him to this lonely place. "You won't fail this time," she said, her voice full of a certainty she didn't feel. He looked at her, his eyes full of a terrible, raw gratitude. He didn't say anything, but he squeezed her hand, and it was enough. As the night wore on, the labor intensified. The pain became a living thing, a monster with claws and teeth. Jackson's calm demeanor never wavered, but Grace could see the tension in his jaw, the deep concern in his eyes. "Almost time," he said, his voice low. "The baby's moving down." He washed his hands, scrubbing them with harsh lye soap, his movements deliberate and precise. He was fighting his own ghosts, battling the memory of the fever that had stolen his family. This time, he would be clean. This time, he would win. He examined her, his touch gentle but professional. She saw the frown that creased his forehead. "What is it?" she asked, her voice tight with fear. "The baby's turned slightly," he said, his voice carefully neutral. "Not ideal. We need to try and move it." He had her change positions, turning onto her side, then onto her hands and knees. Each movement was agony. The pain was unbearable, ripping her apart from the inside. "I can't," she sobbed, tears streaming down her face. "I can't do this." "Yes, you can," he said, his voice firm but kind. He wiped her sweaty forehead with a cool cloth. "You are the strongest woman I have ever met, Grace Sullivan. You're almost there. I can see the head." His words, his belief in her, gave her a new surge of strength. She took a deep breath, ready for the final push. "Now, Grace," he commanded, his voice ringing with urgency. "Push! Now!" She bore down with every last ounce of strength she possessed, a primal scream tearing from her throat. The pain was blinding, all-consuming. And then, release. A sudden, shocking emptiness. The cabin was silent. For one terrifying, eternal second, the only sound was the howl of the wind. And then, a cry. Thin, angry, and beautiful. The sound of a new life taking its first breath. "A girl," Jackson said, his voice thick with an emotion she'd never heard from him before. He sounded like he was about to weep. "You have a daughter." He laid the tiny, squirming baby on her chest. Grace looked down at the red, wrinkled face, the impossibly small fist waving in the air, and her heart felt like it was going to burst. "Hello," she whispered, her voice choked with tears. She ran a trembling finger down the baby's perfect cheek. "Hello, Hope." Jackson worked quickly, his hands sure and steady, cutting the cord, cleaning the baby, making sure they were both safe. But his eyes kept coming back to the infant, a look of pure, unadulterated wonder on his face. This birth wasn't a failure. This birth was a miracle. It wasn't a redemption, not yet, but it was a start. As the storm outside began to fade, a pale gray light seeped through the windows. Dawn was coming. Grace held her daughter close, listening to the rhythm of her own heart and the tiny, rapid beat of the new one against her chest. "Thank you," she said to Jackson, the words completely inadequate. He just nodded, a faint flush creeping up his neck. "I did what needed to be done," he mumbled, turning away to stoke the fire, uncomfortable with her gratitude, with the raw emotion of the moment. Exhaustion finally claimed her. She drifted off to sleep, with hope nestled against her, safe and warm. When she woke up, the cabin was filled with a soft, watery sunlight. Jackson was at his desk, writing in his journal. He looked up when she stirred and came over to the bed. "How are you feeling?" he asked, his voice back to its usual professional tone. "Sore," she admitted, "but well enough." She looked down at Hope, who was still sleeping peacefully. "She's beautiful, isn't she?" His stern face softened as he looked at the baby. "Yes," he agreed softly. "She is." The storm had passed. The world outside was silent and white and sparkling. But they both knew the peace was temporary. The passable roads meant Charles could be on his way. "What will we do?" Grace asked, her voice a whisper, her arms tightening around her daughter. Jackson turned from the window, his face grim but determined. "Whatever is necessary," he said. The next day their allies arrived. Margaret, the tough old midwife, and the local sheriff, a stern-faced man named Miller. They brought supplies and news. "Porter's in town," the sheriff said, his voice flat. "He's got papers claiming his wife has been abducted. He's demanding I come up here and arrest you, Reed." Grace's blood ran cold. "Will you?" The sheriff snorted. "I'm no fool. I know the difference between a concerned husband and a bully with a fat wallet. But the law's on his side, ma'am. A wife is considered her husband's property." "She's not property," Jackson said, his voice like ice. "No decent man would say she is," the sheriff agreed. "But Porter isn't a decent man, and he has money and influence." Just then, another man stepped into the cabin. He was a Native American, wrapped in a colorful blanket, his face weathered and wise. He introduced himself as Thomas Running Elk. "There is another way," he said, his voice quiet but strong. "My people can take you and the child to the reservation. Porter's laws have no power there." It was a tempting offer, a way out, a way to disappear. But Grace looked at Jackson, and she knew. She couldn't run anymore. "Thank you," she said to Thomas. "But I think it's time to stand my ground." Margaret and the sheriff exchanged a look. "You have a plan?" Margaret asked. "The beginnings of one," Jackson said. He told them what he knew, what he suspected, that Charles Porter wasn't just an abusive husband. He was a man with a dark, violent past. A past that Jackson had witnessed firsthand. "Back in the war," Jackson said, his voice low, "at the Battle of Antietam, Porter was a captain. He ordered his men on a suicide mission. When they hesitated, he shot one of them in the back. A private named Williams. I was the surgeon who treated him before he died. I testified at the inquiry." "What happened?" the sheriff asked. "Nothing," Jackson said, his voice bitter. "Porter's father was a powerful senator. The whole thing was buried. But I never forgot. And I don't think he has either." A terrible understanding dawned on Grace. Charles hadn't come to Montana just for her. He had come for Jackson, too, to silence the one man who knew the truth about the monster he really was. "He's not just here to reclaim his wife," Jackson said, his eyes dark. "He's here to bury his past, once and for all." The pieces were all falling into place, revealing a picture more terrifying than Grace could have imagined. Charles wasn't just going to use the law. He was going to use violence. He was going to try and take hope, and he was going to destroy Jackson in the process. The sheriff looked grim. Porter's been asking around town, hiring men, not for protection, for action. A cold, hard knot of fear formed in Grace's stomach. "He's going to try and take her," she whispered. "By force." Jackson's face was like stone. "We'll be ready for him," he said. As their allies left, promising to gather whatever help they could, a new heavy silence descended on the cabin. The battle was no longer a distant threat. It was here. It was now. That night, as Grace rocked her daughter to sleep, she knew she had a choice to make. She could take Thomas's offer. She could run, disappear, and spend the rest of her life looking over her shoulder. Or she could stay. She could stand with this broken, honorable man who had risked everything for her. She could fight. She looked at Hope's tiny, perfect face, sleeping so peacefully, and she knew there was no choice at all. She would not raise her daughter in fear. She would not let the shadow of Charles Porter darken her child's life. She had run from Philadelphia seeking safety. She had followed Edward seeking hope. Here in this small, lonely cabin, with this quiet, dangerous man, she had finally found the courage to stop running. She had finally found her home, and she would defend it with her very last breath. The real storm was about to break, and this time Grace was ready for it. The next 2 days passed in a blur of tense preparation. The coming storm Jackson had predicted rolled in, another blizzard that cut them off from the world, giving them an unexpected, temporary reprieve. They used the time. Jackson showed Grace how to load and fire the rifle. He barricaded the windows and reinforced the doors. Grace packed a small bag for Hope, ready to flee to the root cellar at a moment's notice. They worked in a strange, companionable silence, a new kind of intimacy growing between them. It wasn't love, not yet. It was something deeper, the bond of two soldiers preparing to face a common enemy. On the third morning the storm broke. The world outside was blindingly white and silent. Too silent. It was just after dawn when Grace saw them, shadows moving through the trees at the edge of the clearing. 3, no, 5 of them. "They're here," she whispered, her voice tight. Jackson was by her side in an instant, his face a grim mask. He moved with a quiet, deadly efficiency, taking his position by the door. "Get Hope," he commanded, "and stay down." A voice cut through the cold morning air. Charles's voice, smooth, arrogant, and dripping with menace. "Reed, I know you're in there. I've come for my wife and child. Send them out, and this can all be over." Jackson didn't answer. He just waited, his rifle ready. "Don't be a fool, Reed," Charles shouted, his voice getting angrier. "The law's on my side." Still, Jackson was silent. Grace understood his strategy. Let Charles make the first move. Let him show his true colors. Then the attack came. 2 of the hired men rushed the back of the cabin, their axes splintering the door. Charles and 2 others charged the front. A shot rang out, Jackson's rifle. A warning shot, fired over their heads. "Grace!" he yelled. "The cellar! Now!" She scrambled toward the trap door, clutching a crying Hope to her chest. But she was too late. The front door burst open, and Charles stood there, his face a mask of fury, a pistol in his hand. "Don't move, Reed," he snarled. Jackson froze, caught between the attackers at the front and the back. Charles's cold eyes found Grace. "It's time to come home, my dear," he said, his voice dangerously soft. Grace stood up, her chin high, her fear replaced by a cold, hard rage. "This is my home, Charles," she said, "and I am never going back to you." His face contorted with fury. "You don't have a choice," he screamed, taking a step towards her. "That child is mine. You are mine." "The law," Jackson said, his voice cutting through the tension, "doesn't permit a man to beat his wife, to terrorize her, to treat her like property." Charles laughed, a short, ugly sound. "The law concerns itself with public matters, Dr. Reed, not private ones." "Is that what you told yourself at Antietam?" Jackson shot back, his voice like steel. "Was that a private matter when you shot Private Williams in the back?" The color drained from Charles's face. For the first time, he looked truly shocked. "Lies," he hissed. "Ancient history." "Not to the men who died that day," Jackson said. "Not to the army inquiry that your father had buried." "It's your word against mine," Charles sneered, recovering his composure. "A disgraced doctor versus a respected state representative. Who do you think they'll believe?" "It's not just his word." A new voice came from the doorway. Everyone spun around. Sheriff Miller stood there, flanked by 2 armed deputies, and behind him was Margaret and Thomas Running Elk, and with them was an old man in a faded Union Army uniform. "Colonel James Harrington," the sheriff said, his voice grim. "He presided over the initial inquiry into Captain Porter's actions at Antietam. Seems he's been waiting a long, long time to tell his story." It was over. Charles knew it. The trap had closed. His face for a moment was a mask of pure, naked hatred. Then the politician took over. He straightened his coat, his expression becoming smooth and unreadable again. But it was too late. The monster had shown its face. As the sheriff's men disarmed him, Charles's eyes met Grace's across the room. "This isn't over," he whispered, a silent, deadly promise. But it was. The arrival of Colonel Harrington was the final nail in his coffin. With Jackson's testimony and the colonel's, the old war crimes would be brought to light. Combined with the charges of assault and kidnapping, Charles Porter's political career was over. His life as a free man was over. As the deputies led him away, a strange, profound silence fell over the cabin. It was the sound of a battle won, the sound of freedom. Grace looked at Jackson, her heart overflowing with a gratitude so deep it left her speechless. He had done it. He had faced his ghosts. He had kept his promise. He crossed the room in 3 long strides and pulled her into his arms. She buried her face in his chest, breathing in the scent of pine and wood smoke and safety. It was the first time she had felt truly safe in years. When they finally pulled apart, he looked down at her, his steel-colored eyes full of a raw, vulnerable emotion she'd never seen before. "I thought," he started, his voice rough, "I thought I was going to fail again, like I did with Sarah." Grace reached up and touched his face, her fingers gentle against his rough cheek. "You didn't fail, Jackson," she said softly. "You stood your ground." "We stood our ground," he corrected her, his voice thick. He took her hand, his fingers lacing through hers. The days that followed were a blur. The story of the standoff at Pine Ridge became a local legend. Charles Porter was taken back east to face a trial that would strip him of his power and his freedom. The world Grace had been so terrified of had been defeated. One evening, as the snow fell softly outside the cabin window, Grace sat by the fire, rocking Hope in her arms. Jackson sat opposite her, quietly carving another small wooden animal. "What happens now?" she asked, her voice a whisper. He looked up, his face serious. "That," he said slowly, "depends on what you want." She looked around the small, simple cabin, at the warm fire, at the sleeping baby in her arms, at the quiet, steady man who had saved her in more ways than one. "I want to stay," she said, the words coming from a place of deep, unwavering certainty. "Here, with you, if that's what you want, too." A slow smile spread across Jackson's face, a real, genuine smile that transformed his stern features and made her heart ache with a new, unfamiliar emotion. "It is," he said, his voice soft, "more than I've wanted anything in a very long time." He reached across the small space between them and took her hand. It wasn't a grand declaration of love, it was something better. It was a beginning, a promise of a new life, built not on lies and fear, but on courage and trust. Outside, the Montana winter stretched on, cold and vast. But inside the small cabin on Pine Ridge, a new family had been forged in the heart of the storm. A disgraced doctor, a fugitive wife, and a baby named Hope. They had faced the darkness together and had come out the other side, into the light. Their pasts were full of pain and loss, but their future, for the first time, was a clean, white page waiting to be written. They had found their freedom, not by running, but by finally, bravely, standing their ground. If you enjoyed this story of survival, courage, and redemption, make sure you hit that subscribe button and turn on notifications. You won't want to miss the next tale we uncover from the dark and forgotten corners of history.